Hi, I'm Brandon Reintjes, Senior Curator at the Missoula Art Museum. I'm here in the exhibition Witness to Wartime, the Painted Diary of Takuichi Fujii, which is on view until December 19th. This exhibition chronicles the story of Fujii, who was a modernist artist who left an incredibly comprehensive visual record of his experience as a Japanese American detainee during World War II. During the 3 years at Minidoka incarceration camp in southern Idaho, Fujii kept a detailed account of his daily life and routines. This resulted in an illustrated diary complete with sketches, landscapes, and self-portraits. Historian Roger Daniels has called this the most remarkable document created by a Japanese American prisoner during wartime incarceration. I recently had the opportunity to discuss the show with Barbara Johns, the show curator, over Zoom. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for watching. Can you tell us how you came to share Fuji's story?
Yes, I've been working on Japanese American artists from Seattle, immigrant generation artists, for some 15 years or so since I left museum work. And there's very little information about Fuji. There are reviews of his work from the 1930s, and other than the fact of his going to Minidoka and being incarcerated during the war, there was really nothing, even major surveys of Asian American artists had only a question mark for his death date. I was beginning a study about the artists in the 1930s, and pure serendipity, I was introduced online to his grandson and heir. His name is Sandy Kita. Sandy is a scholar of Japanese art, and he was completing the translation of his grandfather's diary. He and his wife live in Washington, D.C. Near there, I had research to do, went back, met them. They showed me this collection of well over 100 drawings and paintings along with a diary from the beginning of World War II until the end of the artist's life. There are twice as many as those in the exhibition. It was a stunning sight. I mean, thrilling for a curator and art historian. And I proposed an exhibition. They readily agreed. It has grown, the whole project has grown far beyond our imagination. But Brandon, that was really only beginning. Nothing is titled or dated. The process of sorting, identifying the content, even beginning to interpret, has really taken years. I first met them in 2011. And even though I began to be able to align, to match some of the drawings and paintings with diary entries, nevertheless, to really understand what's happening, as I continue to learn. And at first, I didn't appreciate or understand the importance of the diary. I'm a modernist as an art historian, and it took a couple friends and mentors in the fields of Japanese American studies to really help me understand the detail and the Issei or first generation perspective that the diary brings. And as I told you, I continue to learn. I'm working on a book now, and as I continue to research, I'll find material and think, that's what Fuji's picturing. That's what he's saying.
Fantastic. You talked about much of the material being from the beginning bits of the diary. You know, it's kind of unevenly weighted.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can offer any sort of insight or perspective about what this might mean.
About 40% of the entries pertain to the family's initial exclusion and temporary detention at the Puyallup Assembly Center, which was on the fairgrounds, Washington State Fairgrounds. And that was represented as 4 months out of Fuji's 3.5 years incarceration. But that initial shock of having lost homes, businesses, having been forced to give it all up, being taken and then imprisoned behind double rows of barbed wire fences with armed guards patrolling, machine guns pointing inward. It was a tremendous shock. And it was really those months in temporary detention that forced the Japanese Americans to adapt to communal living, to confinement. And so I think the details that Fuji provides in the diary, details of the daily activities, the daily routine, daily different activities of the generations, because there were three generations confined, and the many different perspectives, viewpoints of guard towers, fences, means of confinement that he identifies. This is the North Gate from this perspective, from this, and on, very specific. Yeah. He begins in some detail once they are transferred to Minidoka. And then from really 1943 and 1944, the number of entries, there are some, but they greatly diminish in number. And after I wrote the Fuji book, since then, I've discovered some letters to that in correspondence. It's clear that during that time, he really was very excited. It appears to me that he was doing a lot of painting, and he was clearly from those letters experimenting with abstraction. Even in the exhibition, when I first organized that, I wasn't sure about the dates of some of those, that Kandinsky-like abstraction and the Picasso-like abstraction. But now I can tell they're wartime. Yeah. And then I should say, I'll add one more thing. The diary resumes in frequency in 1945. In December 1944, the administrator, the WRA administrator, Stafford of the camp, announced that the camp would be closed. All the war relocation camps would be closed by the following year. About 44% of people remained in the camp, and they were stricken by anxiety about what would happen when they were literally forced to leave now, because at least it provided security. They had lost, most of them had lost everything. So the entries really pick up again greatly for Fuji during that last year.
That's so incredible. Thank you for that careful account. One of the things that we noticed, go ahead.
I'll just add that last year, you really see the anxiety. I mean, he pictures it. He pictures the daily activities as well, carrying on, but it's very dark in the past. The last 10 pages have no text, but we don't need them to see the darkness and the anxiety in them.
It's incredible. Thinking about that darkness and anxiety, when we were planning for this exhibition and reviewing your selections and how you put the checklist together and reading through that wonderful text, The Hope of Another Spring, we really focused a lot on the racism and discrimination that Fuji experienced. And in some ways, the history of Japanese American confinement during World War II is not as widely known as you might think. In Montana in particular, there's been this whitewashing of our state and local history. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what lessons you feel like history can teach us.
That's a huge question.
It is.
What we call race is in large part visual difference. And Isabel Wilkerson, in a new book, Caste, points out that people have always needed to see themselves above someone else. And visual difference is a ready target. When immigration from Japan began in the late 19th century, one of the fiercest voices leading the anti-Japanese movement was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia. The anti-Japanese movement followed a history of anti-Japanese, anti-Asian agitation, I should say. Workers from China had been recruited to build the railroads across the country. But as they began to settle, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 barred further immigration from China. And it was the first federal, significant federal act to begin to limit or restrict immigration to the United States. The anti Japanese movement grew by fits and starts, often fed by fear of economic competition. And step by step, immigrants from Japan were constrained and denied the rights to own or to lease land, denied the rights to naturalized citizenship. And finally, that whole movement culminated then in the mass exclusion of people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. And there were three generations: immigrant generation and their second and third, their American born children and grandchildren, who were American citizens by birthright. So we we see in this here that our democratic institutions are not immune from miscarriage of justice and abuse. Um, 40 years after the orders for the mass exclusion and incarceration of Japanese Americans, a congressional investigation in the early 1980s concluded that the root causes were racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership at all three branches of government: the executive, congressional, and the Supreme Court. And I think we all see that the events of recent years, the anti Muslim reaction to 9/11, the anguish about immigration, and the killing of Black Americans, shows us that these issues are very much with us. And they show us how easy it is to target and vilify an entire group whom we perceive to be different.
I think it's amazing that art and a visual record can tell us so much about history and
Yeah.
things of this nature. And the next question was really about Fuji's story relating to citizenship and due process in the American context. But you answered so eloquently in your previous answer. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Um, well, yes. So there is something very specific to the ideas of citizenship and due process, particularly, and the Constitution. Because as people of Japanese ancestry, and I emphasized all three generations, were forced, the third generation were mostly babies and toddlers, very young, but were forced from their homes and confined. It was solely on the basis of their ethnicity. No charges were ever brought specifically, and no betrayal was ever proven, ever brought. And the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution specifically declares that people cannot be imprisoned without due process of law. Densho is an excellent online resource that I think you've called out in the exhibition. Yeah. And I looked it up and thinking about our conversation this morning, Brandon. And they say, pointing out what they have done to record the Japanese American experience, the material bears witness to the fact that when threatened, we can easily discard our democratic ideals of justice and equality to chase after imaginary enemies. False rumors can overwhelm and contradict research and evidence-based analysis. That's from them.
It's given us pause to think and reflect and use this exhibition to connect to current events in many ways. And when one's life, like Fuji's, is so enmeshed in historical events, I think we tend to view them through that lens. We look at the activities that are happening, and you kind of see what's happening in the world and look at the exhibition through that lens as well. In Fuji's case, I think we look at him in terms of World War II and also Japanese American confinement.
However, he really was a significant artist both before and after this experience. I'm wondering if you can offer any insights about him as an artist.
Yes, I'll try. I know of only 12 paintings before the war, beginning with 1930, and that's not a lot of evidence. But of those, to to my eye, they're rather uneven. Naturally, I've chosen the best for the exhibition, and I had a few more in the exhibition originally, and then more and more, it really seemed as if the the true import, both of his contribution, I will say, and of the interest in the exhibition was the war, and so more and more, the exhibition focused on that. There are also more paintings from post-war, quite a few more, but not a whole lot. One important exception after the war is that I think, and there's no, as I say, nothing is dated, but I think it likely that a number of the watercolors may have been painted after the war as he continued to reflect on his experience. There's just very, very scant evidence that, and a slight memory from his grandfather, who was who was 14 when Fuji died, so he knew him, but still he was a child. Most of it. They had an exhibition at a community center in Chicago where he lived after the war, but it's so scant, we can't really say. Um, but even so, in during throughout the work of the war years, um, we do. I think you can see his skill and confidence grow, and see that played out in the post-war work. But I still think that the wartime remains as his really major contribution.
Uh, Sitting here in the corner of the exhibition, the lights just timed out, and so I've been plunged into darkness, which I think is really curious. Um, we did notice that there's another artist in Montana, Ben Steele, who ended up documenting the Bataan Death March, and that collection is held at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. And there are a handful of pieces that were created while he was incarcerated. But much like you suspect with Fuji, the majority of the pieces were revisited after the event, almost like a catharsis that he couldn't let that subject matter go,
Mhm.
and he continued to create pieces about the Bataan Death March for the rest of his life.
Mhm.
And the connections between Ben Steele's work and Fuji's work, I think, are so significant. Although I'm really impressed at the consistency of Fuji's work and vision as you walk around the exhibition and see all of these pieces.
And I don't want to overemphasize the work that he may have painted after the war, because a lot of it, the pieces of Minidoka, all of those of Puyallup, have a parallel in the diary. Some of those of Minidoka do, others are fresh views, and they have, as you can tell, a freshness and an immediacy that tells us they were painted on site. You know, so I think I don't want to emphasize the post-war work, and it's all educated guesswork. I just wanted to add that it was very exciting to find the letters about his interest in abstraction during the war, and these are very immediate. It happened after the book was published, after the exhibition was organized. But he was. It's his daughter who was writing another artist, George Tsutakawa, a very well-known artist and a friend of. She was really between the age of the two, and she's just writing him on how her dad is just crazy about abstraction, and he's making these like crazy, just obsessed by it. So it's fun, yeah. And I'll add that, since we're on Zoom, as I sat at my desk, this watercolor is by George Tsutakawa,
Wow,
and it was in Fuji's
fantastic.
papers, dated 1943. And Sudakawa's letters, he was in the army serving. Um, he is a Nisei, American born, but he talks himself about reading philosophy and about how he thinks that pure music, pure ideas, pure art is the wave of the future. And so to think that this in 1943 was in Fuji's papers, among very, very few remnants of papers of any kind, is pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and you can see the relationship between Sudakawa's work and Fuji's work, and almost immediately there's a striking visual resemblance to some of the experiments Fuji did.
I didn't know this at the time.
What a remarkable piece. That's incredible. It's so exciting. The other thing I really admire about Fuji is that he doesn't give us just a straight account of of what he's seeing. He's constantly experimenting, almost restlessly, and you can see in the certain pieces of the exhibition, he's really experimenting with how to depict things according to abstract or modernist principles.
And as I've learned more and more and appreciated more and more, his voice is very much an Issei voice, very restrained, sometimes ironic, but it's not direct, very seldom direct and fully descriptive. It's very restrained anyway. So there's a lot to learn, and it's exciting to keep learning it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for organizing this wonderful exhibition and allowing us to share it here in Missoula, Montana.
Thank you.
So
I wish I could be there with you.
Yeah.
So be it. But thanks for carrying on. Okay.
Yeah.
Good, Brandon. Okay.